So I'd like to welcome to the stage someone who's worked extremely hard for the UK Veterans cause, being our champion in the House of Commons, and working on behalf of John Morris and Laura Morris and Elizabeth, who's here today, and ensuring that the UK government does not forget the nuclear veterans. Can I introduce Rebecca Long-Bailey, MP?
Thanks so much for inviting me here today. It's absolutely humbling, frankly, to be sat in a room with so many people who I know have been so dedicated to fighting against this injustice that you've travelled hours and hours and hours yesterday just to get here to tell your story and to be heard. And I'm sadly one in a long list of MPs right across the House, because this isn't a party political issue, it's a fight for justice, but I'm one in a long list of many who over the years have been absolutely horrified to hear of the pain and suffering that nuclear testing veterans and their families have been through. And like so many people, I wasn't aware of nuclear testing veterans and what happened all of those years ago. We were proud, as our Lord Mayor said, to be one of the first nuclear-free cities here in Manchester. And that was something that I was always proud of growing up. But I never thought about what happened before then, what happened when we were creating those nuclear weapons, and who was involved in those tests. Now, like so many, I was absolutely horrified to hear of the stories of veterans and their families. So many people sent to the South Pacific with little detail as to what they were actually doing there, what risks they were going to be exposed to, no protection and no recognition of how their lives were going to be devastated as a result. And that's bad enough. But for those injuries to be ignored for decades, to be dismissed in many cases as pure fantasy, when all of the evidence suggested otherwise, is just about the worst thing that any government can do to its people, in my view. Now, I first heard about the nuclear testing veterans story when I met my constituent Laura Morris and the granddaughter of nuclear test veteran John Morris. And she told me about the difficulties that her own family had been through. John, who's here today, is now 84, he doesn't look it, it's fantastic for 84, served at Operation Grapple and witnessed 4 nuclear explosions while serving at Kirimati, Christmas Island. And John had since been diagnosed with cancer, developing pernicious anemia, and he was even wrongly arrested over the cot death of his son Stephen. Now, heartbreakingly, John said, and he'll speak to everybody later on today, but he said, "We washed the scientists' contaminated coats in with the uniforms for everyone else. I've always wondered if I gave my son something that killed him. I've spent 60 years fighting to be heard, but no one will give me the answers." When I heard this, like most of my officers who were there as well, I was brought to tears and I was appalled. There have been no medals for the thousands of veterans like John involved in nuclear weapons tests overseas, putting their lives and their families' lives at risk in the name of our national security to keep us all safe. No thanks for what they did, for what their families went through. And studies of those veterans have shown that there's increased miscarriage, increased birth defect, and the same rate of genetic damage as clean-up workers at Chernobyl. Yet despite this being known, the UK is one of the only nuclear powers on earth who has denied recognition of its nuclear testing veterans. As you heard already from our Lord Mayor, at the end of last year, even US President Joe Biden awarded a gong to its own atomic testing heroes, some of whom served alongside our British veterans. Now, after I met John and Laura, I met Alan Owen of LABRATS International. I also met long-time campaigner Susie Boniface and heard more about the veterans' fight for justice. As you'll hear today, Alan's father tragically died at 52 after witnessing 24 nuclear weapons tests in 78 days on Christmas Island in 1962. And Alan and Susie, as you know, have been relentlessly campaigning for justice for decades. I also met Steve Pearce and his family who are here today and heard about the devastating consequences that nuclear testing had on their family. I also heard stories from other people in Salford, where I live, people who don't want to be named because they don't want people to know what their families have been through. And I heard their horrifying stories, the family secrets, the worries that people, descendants through the generations, might be affected by this. And last night I heard from a lovely man called Jeff Stewart in Australia, who might be watching online today. His mum and dad, Marie and Jim Stewart, were from Manchester. His dad was in the Royal Navy from 1946 to 1958, and he was involved in Operation Hurricane. And they're a fine-looking pair, his mum and dad. I've looked at the photos. But they're fighting for justice as well, the Stewart family, and they need and deserve answers. Now, the search for those answers and recognition for what people went through is acute. Yet I'm struck constantly as a politician by the brick walls and secrecy that people have faced over the years. Unfortunately, for so many, the government continues to argue that there's no evidence in general that nuclear test veterans or others present at the tests were irradiated or suffer increased incidence of cancers or other causes of mortality, thus continuing to support the recommendation that a medal should not be issued to veterans, that it doesn't meet the relevant tests for risk and rigour. But extensive international research and information shows that there is genuine increased incidences of medical conditions within these veterans and their families. Now, there is some positive news. Over the last few months, as part of the LABRATS and Daily Mirror's Look Me in the Eye campaign, I arranged for John, Laura and other campaigners to meet with the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer, and Shadow Defence Secretary John Healey, and they confirmed Labour's 2019 manifesto position, their commitment to veterans, making it a starting point in Labour's recognition of nuclear testing veterans. These veterans also met with Andy Burnham, the Greater Manchester Mayor, and other Metro Mayors across the region, who also pledged to wholeheartedly support their campaign. And even further, recently, I think Boris Johnson was having a difficult day at the time because it was right in the middle of lots of turmoil. But I finally got picked to do Prime Minister's questions. It's a bit like winning the lottery when you do Prime Minister's questions. You put your name in, and you could be putting it in for months and months and months, and we've been putting out my name in for months, hoping that we'd get picked so that we could ask a question about nuclear testing veterans. And my name came out in the ballot, and we asked the question. Now, all of the Conservative MPs had been absolutely barracking Boris Johnson for this, that and the other. And I was one of the very last questions, and I asked Boris Johnson, would he meet nuclear testing veterans and hear their stories? And I tried to make him understand their calls for medallic recognition. And he said yes. And since then, we've been trying to organise the meeting, and we're hopeful that we'll get a meeting in the diary, because all veterans want to see is to be able to look Boris Johnson in the eye, tell their stories, tell us horrific stories that their family members have been through, and finally be recognised after 70 years of struggle and injustice. It's not too much to ask when all the nuclear powers across the world have recognised what their nuclear testing veterans have been through, but also what they did to protect their countries. We need to do the same here in Britain, and I know myself and all of the MPs that I'm working with in Parliament on a cross-party basis are going to continue this fight. So thank you for letting me be part of today, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from everybody today. Thank you.